They thought she had fallen apart. They were completely wrong, 64 years old, a widow, and they thought she had nothing left to lose. At her husband's memorial dinner, in front of her entire family and guests, her daughter-in-law, a young, ambitious woman as cold as stone, stood up and declared, "You have 30 days to get out of this house." The dining room fell silent. Everyone expected her to cry, beg, or break down. Instead, she just smiled. It was a smile that should have terrified everyone from that moment on, but they didn't realize it, and that was the biggest mistake of their lives. Please like and leave a comment with the city name you're viewing. I want to know how far my story has come. And now, sit back, because this story won't let you down until the very end, the night they made their first mistake. I need to tell you something about silence, not the comfortable kind, not the silence of an empty house on a Sunday morning, or the quiet after a good meal when everyone is too full and too happy to speak. I'm talking about the other kind, the kind that settles into a room like smoke, thick and unmoving when something terrible has just been said out loud, when words that can never be taken back have already landed. That was the silence in my dining room on the evening of March 14th, and I was the one sitting at the center of it. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 64 years old. I have been a wife, a mother, a business partner, and a keeper of secrets that were never really mine to carry. For 41 years, I helped build something, a family, a home, a life, with a man named Richard Hale, who died 26 months ago from a heart attack that took him on a Tuesday afternoon in the garden he loved, without warning, without ceremony, and without giving me the chance to say everything I still needed to say. Grief does strange things to a person. It doesn't just hurt. It reorganizes you. It moves things around inside until you don't quite recognize yourself anymore. And for 2 years, I had been living inside that reorganization, quieter than I used to be, slower to anger, more careful with my words. People who didn't know me well mistook that quietness for fragility, for defeat. They looked at a 64-year-old widow sitting alone in a big house, and they saw a problem waiting to be solved. Celeste Vaughn Hale, my daughter-in-law, had decided she was the solution. The memorial dinner had been her idea. She'd called me 3 weeks before and suggested it with the kind of warmth that I had learned over years to distrust. Celeste always led with warmth. It was her technique, the way a salesman smiles before he tells you the price. "Margaret," she'd said, her voice smooth and practiced, "it's been 2 years. The family should come together. Honor Richard properly. Don't you think he would have wanted that?" She knew exactly how to use Richard's name. She'd always known. I said yes, of course, because what was I going to say? No, let's not honor my husband? She had calculated that perfectly. So I said yes, and I spent 2 weeks cooking, Richard's favorites, the old recipes, the ones that took all day and made the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. I set the table with the good china, the pieces Richard and I had picked out together at an estate sale in Vermont the year we got married, each one slightly mismatched and all the more beautiful for it. I wanted the evening to feel like him. I wanted to bring him back into the room, even just for a few hours. I should have known that Celeste had different plans for the evening. They arrived in waves. First came my younger son, Daniel, with his wife Paula and their 2 kids, 8-year-old Lily, who ran to me with her arms open before she even got through the door, and 10-year-old Marcus, who had recently discovered that he was too old to hug grandmothers but still held my hand for a moment before letting go. Daniel was my quieter son, the thoughtful one. He looked around the house when he came in with the particular expression of someone who had been worrying about something and was trying not to show it. "Mom," he said, hugging me, "you didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," I said, and I meant it. Then came the cousins, Richard's side mostly. Margaret Frozeℹ, who had been Richard's favorite aunt and was now 91 and moving through the world with the unhurried authority of someone who had outlasted everyone who ever doubted her. Richard's cousin Thomas with his second wife. A handful of neighbors who'd known us for decades. People who had loved Richard in their various and imperfect ways. Ethan arrived last, my eldest son, 40 years old. Richard's hair, Richard's height, Richard's hands, but somewhere along the way he had traded Richard's backbone for something softer, something that bent in whatever direction Celeste pointed. He kissed my cheek at the door. "You look good, Mom." You look tired, I said. Because he did. He had dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him, 6 weeks ago. Something was sitting heavy on him, and I didn't yet know what it was. Celeste came in behind him like she always did, after him, but somehow managing to make her entrance feel like the main one. She was 42, impeccably dressed in a black wrap dress that was sophisticated enough for a memorial dinner and expensive enough to make a statement. She had the kind of beauty that photographs well and unsettles people in person. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that were always calculating the room. She kissed both my cheeks, the European style, left then right, and said, "Margaret, the house looks wonderful. You've really kept it up." Something about the word kept bothered me, like I was the caretaker of a museum, but I smiled and thanked her because I was 64 years old and I had learned that not every battle needs to be fought the moment it presents itself. That was a lesson she was about to learn herself. Dinner was good. I say this not with vanity, but with relief. I had been afraid that grief might have taken something from my cooking, that food made for someone who was gone might taste like absence. But the lamb was tender, the roasted root vegetables caramelized exactly right. The bread was warm and the wine was the Bordeaux that Richard had kept in the cellar for occasions. And someone, Daniel, I think, made a toast that was simple and honest and made 3 people cry without being maudlin about it. To Richard, Daniel said, "Who taught us that a man's character is what he does when nobody's watching?" There was a particular pause after that sentence, the kind that happens when words land somewhere complicated. I saw Celeste's eyes move, just briefly, to Ethan. And I saw Ethan look down at his plate. I filed that away. We talked. We remembered. Margaret Forsythe told a story about Richard as a young man that made everyone laugh. Something about a fishing trip in a borrowed boat, and a lie that got increasingly elaborate over 3 days. The children played in the other room. The candles burned low. For a while, it almost felt like what I had wanted it to feel like he was there. And then Celeste set down her wine glass. I don't know exactly when I sensed it, that particular shift in energy that means something is about to happen. Maybe it was the way she straightened in her chair. Maybe it was the small signal she gave Ethan with her eyes. The one he received with a slight nod that he probably thought no one noticed. Maybe it was just 40 years of reading rooms, of watching people, of understanding that certain kinds of stillness are not rest, but preparation. My hands were folded in my lap under the table. I pressed them together. I waited. "Margaret," Celeste said. She used my first name. She had always called me Margaret, never Mom, never Mrs. Hale, and I had never pushed the issue, though it had always felt like a small, deliberate statement. "You are not my family. You are just a person I tolerate." "Yes," I said. She smiled. The warm one. The salesman one. "I think this is the right moment, with everyone here, with the family together, to talk about something that Ethan and I have been discussing for quite some time." She paused, letting the air thicken. She was good at this. She knew how to make silence work for her. About the future. About what makes sense going forward for everyone. I heard the children laughing in the other room, a distant, clean sound. I focused on it for a moment. "We think," Celeste continued, and now her voice had that practiced gentleness that people use when they are about to say something cruel and want to have the delivery on record as evidence of their reasonableness. "That it doesn't make sense for you to be here alone, in a house this size, at your age. It's too much upkeep. It's isolating. Frankly, it's not practical." I looked at Ethan. He was looking at his wine glass. "We've done some research," she said, and now she reached into the slim leather portfolio she had brought, which I now understood she had brought precisely for this moment, and removed a small stack of papers. She slid them across the table toward me with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed this exact gesture. "There are some really lovely communities, independent living, very high quality. One in particular is only 40 minutes from us, so we'd be close. You'd have people your own age, activities, medical support nearby. People your own age, as though I were a problem to be sorted by demographic." I did not touch the papers. "You want me to move to a retirement community?" I said. I kept my voice completely even, not a question, a statement of fact. "We want what's best for you," Celeste said, and she had the audacity to reach across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were cold. "And honestly, Margaret, the estate is a lot to manage, the upkeep, the taxes. the decisions that need to be made. It's a responsibility that really should be Celeste. This was Daniel. His voice was tight. What exactly are you proposing? She looked at him with the patient, slightly condescending expression of someone who believes they are the smartest person in any given room. We're proposing, she said, that Margaret consider transitioning out of the estate for her own well-being. We've spoken with an attorney. There are options for how the property could be managed going forward that would benefit the whole family. That would free Margaret from the burden, I said quietly. She stopped. The table went very still. I think it was my tone. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved. But something in the way I said those two words, flat, measured, quiet, made several people at the table look at me. Really look at me. The way you look at something when you've just realized it might be more than you thought it was. That's what you called it, I said. A burden. I didn't mean it that way, Celeste said smoothly. I meant the responsibility. You said burden. I still hadn't raised my voice. That's the word you chose. I looked around the table slowly. At Ethan, who still hadn't looked up. At Daniel, whose jaw was tight with the particular fury of someone trying to decide whether to explode. At the cousins, the neighbors. At Margaret Frozeℹ, who was watching me with dark, calm eyes that had seen a great many things. I'd like to make sure everyone at this table heard the word she chose. Silence. Margaret, Celeste said, and now the warmth was gone. Just slightly, just enough to let me see what was underneath it. I'm trying to have a mature conversation about the future. Surely you can understand. How long? I asked. She blinked. I'm sorry? How long do I have? I looked at her steadily. You said 30 days. I'm assuming that's still the number? I'd like to hear you say it in front of everyone. And here was the thing about Celeste Von Hale. She was ambitious, and she was ruthless, and she was very, very good at what she did. But she was also proud. Too proud to back down when she felt she was being challenged. It was her one flaw, the crack in the armor, and I had found it years ago and waited patiently until the right moment to press. She lifted her chin. 30 days, she said, to begin the process. The room erupted. Daniel was on his feet. Are you serious? You're giving our mother an ultimatum at our father's memorial dinner? What is wrong with you? Thomas, Richard's cousin, said something under his breath that I was glad the children weren't in the room to hear. Paula had her hand over her mouth. Margaret Frozeℹ said nothing. She was watching me. Ethan finally looked up. He opened his mouth and closed it again without saying a single word. And in that silence, in that failure to defend his own mother at his own father's table, I watched something in Daniel's face change. A door closing, perhaps permanently. Celeste was talking, trying to regain control of the room, saying things about practicality and the family's future, and we all want what's best. But I had stopped listening to her. I was looking at the candles. They were burning low, dripping wax down the sides of the silver holders I'd had for 30 years. Richard had bought them at a market in Portugal on our 15th anniversary. We'd wrapped them in sweaters to bring them home in our suitcases. I thought about that trip, the tiny hotel with the blue-tiled bathroom, the way he'd laughed when I told him the candlesticks were ugly and then bought them anyway because I secretly loved them. I thought, you would know exactly what to do right now, Richard. You always did. And then I thought, no. You always said I was the one who knew. I stood up. Not dramatically, not with the sudden energy of anger. I simply stood, the way you stand when you have decided something. The room slowly quieted. All right, I said. Celeste stopped talking. She looked at me with something she was trying to control but hadn't quite managed. Something close to surprise. All right, she repeated. You've said what you wanted to say. My voice was calm, genuinely calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing rage, but the real kind. The kind that comes from already knowing what comes next. And I've heard you. All of you have heard each other. I looked at Ethan one last time. He finally held my gaze, and what I saw there was not cruelty. It was shame, which, in some ways, was worse. I'll have an answer for you soon. Margaret, Daniel started. Daniel, I touched his arm gently. Please. Not tonight. I began to clear plates. No one else moved. They all sat at that table in the wreckage of what had just happened, with the good china and the good wine and the photographs of Richard on the sideboard behind them, and they watched me carry dishes to the kitchen as calmly as if nothing unusual had occurred. Because I needed them to see that. I needed Celeste to see that. The guests left in ones and twos over the next hour. There were the awkward goodbyes, the hugs that lasted a beat too long because people didn't know what to say, the looks that said, "I'm so sorry," without the courage to say it out loud. Thomas pressed my hand when he left and said very quietly, "Richard would have burned the whole table down," and I almost laughed. Daniel was the last family member to go. He stood at my front door with his coat in his hands, and tears he was refusing to shed standing in his eyes. "Mom," he said, "tell me what to do. Tell me how to help." "Go home to your family," I said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "No," I agreed, "but I will be. That's different." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way his father used to nod, like a man accepting something he didn't fully understand but trusted anyway. He kissed my forehead and left. I stood in the doorway and watched his car lights disappear down the driveway. Then I went back inside. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because I genuinely didn't feel like crying. What I felt was something else. Something older and quieter, and in its own way much more dangerous. I felt clarity. I moved through the house slowly, turning off lights. The dining room last. I stood in the doorway and looked at what remained. The emptied plates, the wine glasses with their dark rings, the candles extinguished now, the good china waiting to be washed. The photographs of Richard on the sideboard, him at 30, at 45, at 60, getting gray at the temples and laughing about it. "All right," I said to him quietly. "You ready?" The house didn't answer. Houses don't answer. But I had spent 41 years in this one, and sometimes it felt like the walls remembered things even when the people inside them forgot. I went to the kitchen and washed every dish by hand. I dried them. I put them away. I cleaned the stove, wiped the counters, folded the dish towels neatly. Methodical, unhurried, like a person preparing for something. Then I went to my study. Yes, Richard's study, originally. We'd shared it for years, his enormous roll-top desk on one side, my smaller writing desk on the other, and 40 years of accumulated paper and photographs and filing systems known only to each of us. After he died, I'd kept everything exactly as he left it. The lawyers had advised me about estate organization, and I'd nodded at them and then done precisely nothing with their advice because I wasn't ready. I was ready now. I sat at his desk. It still smelled like him, faintly. Or maybe that was my imagination, my memory filling in what was no longer there. Cedar and old paper, and the particular smell of a man who worked with his hands even when he didn't need to. I opened the bottom drawer, the one that no one else had ever touched, that Richard had shown me once, and said quietly, "This is just for the two of us, Maggie." And I pulled out a metal box. The key was on my keychain. It had been on my keychain for 15 years. I unlocked it. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder were documents I hadn't looked at since Richard put them there. Legal papers. Signed. Witnessed. Filed with the county recorder's office in the spring of 2003. I read through them slowly. Every page. In the quiet of the house, with the lights low and the clock on the mantel ticking, I sat at my dead husband's desk and read the truth that Celeste Vaughn Hale had apparently never thought to look for. When I finished, I closed the folder. I sat for a long time. Then I said out loud to no one and to everyone, "Oh, Celeste," not with anger, with something closer to pity. "You came into this house and you decided I was the obstacle, but you never bothered to ask what kind of foundation you were standing on. You never thought to look down, and that was your mistake. Not a small one." Sleep, when it came that night, came deep and without dreams. I woke at 6 in the morning to pale light through the curtains and the sound of birds beginning their noise in the old oak tree outside the window. Richard had planted that tree 30 years ago. He'd brought it home as a sapling in the back of his truck, and I'd said it would never survive the first winter. It was now taller than the house. I lay in bed for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling. Then I got up. I made coffee. Real coffee. French press. The way I liked it, Not the weak, tasteless thing I'd started making after Richard died because strong coffee for one person felt like excess. Today, it did not feel like excess. Today, it felt correct. I took my coffee to the study. I called my attorney. His name was William Garner, and he had been our family's lawyer for 22 years, and he was 71 years old and semi-retired, and he had come to Richard's funeral in a suit that had seen better days and cried without embarrassment or apology, which told me everything I needed to know about his character. He answered on the third ring. It was 6:40 in the morning. "Margaret," he said without surprise. 22 years. He knew the sound of a serious call. "William," I said, "I need to meet with you this week, and I need you to bring someone from your white-collar practice. Someone good, someone young, someone who can look at financial records." A brief pause. "Should I be concerned?" "Not for us," I said. "But yes, you should probably be concerned." Another pause. "Tuesday work?" "Tuesday is fine." I hung up. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the oak tree. 30 days, Celeste had said. She had given me 30 days as though time were the weapon, as though the pressure of a countdown was enough to break me. What she didn't understand, what she had never understood, was that I had not spent 2 years grieving and falling apart. I had spent 2 years getting quiet. And quiet is not the same as empty. Quiet is where you go to think. Quiet is where you go to plan. Ick. 3 days after the dinner, Daniel called. I was in the garden. Richard's garden. Mine now. The roses in their early spring confusion of stems and tentative buds, and I nearly missed the call because my hands were dirty and I had to pull off my gloves and chase my phone across the bench where I'd left it. "Daniel?" "Mom." His voice was taut as wire. "Ethan called me last night." "Oh?" "He wanted to... I don't know what he wanted. He said Celeste was trying to protect the family's future. He actually said that to me. Those words, like he'd practiced them." I pulled off the other glove, sat down on the bench. The morning smelled like damp earth and something green beginning. "He's scared," I said. "Of what?" "Of her," I said simply. "And of himself." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Mom, what are you doing? You said you'd have an answer for them soon. What does that mean? Are you actually going to—" "Daniel," I said gently, "trust me. I do trust you, but I want to understand—" "Not yet." I looked down at the rose bed. The root systems were deep now, after 30 years. You couldn't uproot these roses without destroying the garden around them. They were anchored. When it's time, you'll understand everything. I promise you that. He let out a long breath. This is like watching someone put together a puzzle with the picture face down. "That's a good description," I said, and I meant it. "Are you okay?" "Really?" I thought about the question. I thought about the metal box in the study, the folder inside it, the documents I'd read 3 times now. I thought about Tuesday's meeting with William. I thought about the list I'd begun making in my neat, careful handwriting. Names, dates, numbers, questions. "I'm more okay than I've been in 2 years," I said. "Maybe longer." He didn't entirely believe me, but he didn't push. He said goodbye and I went back to my roses, and I thought about what was coming with the particular calm of someone who has already made their peace with it. Here's what you need to understand about the Hale estate. Not the house itself, although the house is lovely, a 4-bedroom colonial on 4 acres in the hills outside of town, with the garden Richard built and the oak tree he planted, and the study where 2 desks sat side by side for 40 years. The house is worth money, considerable money, but it is not the point. The point is the story people told themselves about it. Ethan had always believed, had been allowed to believe, perhaps had been encouraged to believe, that the house was simply the family home, a shared resource, an inheritance in waiting, something he would one day have authority over by virtue of being the eldest son, by virtue of the particular logic that had been in families since the beginning of time. Celeste had married into that story and made it her North Star. I had watched her, over 15 years of marriage to my son, calculate and position and maneuver herself around that story. She'd pushed Ethan into the family business. She'd cultivated the relationship with the extended family. She'd been charming to Richard when Richard was alive, charming in the particular way of people who are investing in something they expect to pay out. She had been so focused on the prize that she had never thought to verify what the prize actually was. She had never once sat down with a property attorney and asked the simple, obvious, essential question, whose name is actually on the deed? Richard and I had made decisions about this house over 41 years. Quiet decisions. Practical decisions. Decisions made at kitchen tables and in the study and during walks in the garden, the way people who truly run something together actually make decisions, not in dramatic proclamations but in ordinary daily conversations. In 2003, during a period when the family business was going through a restructuring, and there were lawyers and accountants everywhere, and everybody was looking at numbers on paper, Richard had quietly, without announcement, put the house in my name. Mine alone. Not jointly. Not in trust. Mine. He'd done it because he was pragmatic, because he'd talked to the accountant and there were advantages, because at the time it had seemed like a simple financial decision with no drama attached to it. He'd mentioned it to me afterward over dinner, the same way he might have mentioned that he'd picked up groceries. Oh, I had that thing with the property done today. And I had nodded, and we had talked about something else. 23 years later, his daughter-in-law had stood at his memorial dinner and given his widow 30 days to vacate her own property. There was a particular poetry to it that I found almost unbearable. I drove to William's office on Tuesday morning in the old blue Volvo that Richard had insisted was immortal, and that I had continued to drive after his death partly out of stubbornness, and partly because getting rid of it felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. William met me at the door with a handshake and the serious expression of a man who had been thinking hard since Monday. With him was a young woman named Sandra Park, 34, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and a tablet full of spreadsheet software and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years finding things that people had tried hard to hide. She was from William's firm's financial crimes division. We sat at the conference table. I set the folder from the metal box in front of me. Then I set a second folder, the one I had assembled over the previous 3 days, working from my own files, from records I had kept because Richard kept records, and I had kept his records after him. "Tell me what you're looking for," Sandra said. "I don't know exactly," I said. "That's why I brought you." I pushed the second folder across the table. These are records from the family business going back about 10 years. I started noticing things about 6 months ago. Inconsistencies, small ones, invoices that didn't quite match, disbursements I didn't recognize. I have access to the records because I'm still technically a board member, a formality we never updated after Richard died. I don't think anyone noticed. Sandra opened the folder. Her eyes moved quickly across the first page. "How long have you been tracking this?" she asked, without looking up. "Since October," I said. "On and off, when I had the energy." She looked up. "Mrs. Hale, this isn't amateur work. These are good questions." I looked at her steadily. "I've been helping run a company for 40 years. I just didn't do it from the front of the room." She called me 9 days later. 9 days, and her voice on the phone had the precise, controlled quality of someone being careful not to editorialize. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "are you somewhere you can talk?" I was in the study. I was always in the study now. "Yes. I've gone through everything you sent me and pulled additional records. I need to share what I've found." A brief pause. "It's significant." My hand was steady on the phone. "Tell me," she told me. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, the study was completely quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a bird called once and then went silent. "How certain are you?" I asked. "Certain enough," she said. "There are gaps. There always are at this stage, but the pattern is clear. I'd want a full forensic audit to put hard numbers on it, but based on what's visible, we're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, minimum, possibly more." I closed my eyes for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Siphoned quietly through shell companies and inflated invoices, and the kind of careful incremental theft that depends on no one looking closely. Depends on the people with reason to look being kept distracted, being kept off balance, being given ultimatums at memorial dinners. "Who had access to execute this?" I asked. "To actually move the money?" "2 people," she said. based on the signature authorizations and the account access records. She paused again. Your son Ethan and his wife. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about the way Ethan had looked at his wine glass and refused to meet my eyes. I thought about the shame I'd seen in him when our gazes finally connected. I thought about how he had opened his mouth at that dinner table and said nothing. Not in support of Celeste's ultimatum, not in defense of me, just nothing. Sitting there in his silence like a man who has dug himself in so deep he can't see the sky anymore. He had known. Maybe not every detail, but he had known. Mrs. Hale, Sandra said, are you still there? Yes, I said. I'm here. I took a breath. How long to put together a complete report? With proper authorization to access the full business records? 2 weeks? Maybe 3. You have authorization, I said. Whatever you need. William will handle the formalities. Understood. She hesitated. The first real hesitation I'd heard from her. Mrs. Hale, I have to ask, do you want to take this to the authorities? Because at this level of, I want the complete picture first, I said quietly. All of it, every number, every shell company, every signed document. I want to understand exactly what was done, and how, and when. I paused. Then I'll decide what to do with it. Okay, she said. She sounded like she respected that answer. After we hung up, I sat at Richard's desk for a long time. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I thought about the 30-day ultimatum, the leather portfolio with the retirement community brochures, the way Celeste had reached across the table and put her cold hand over mine and said, we want what's best for you. What they'd wanted was to move me out before I had time to look too closely at what they'd been doing. That was what the 30 days was really about. Not caring for an aging mother-in-law, not practical estate management, removing the witness, getting me gone before I found what I was now sitting on. I picked up my pen. I opened the notebook where I kept my list. Under Tuesday meeting and Sandra, financial records and property deed, William, I wrote 4 new words. Invite them to dinner. Issues. I did not make any calls that day. Or the next. I let the days pass at their own pace, and I worked in the garden, and I cooked things I wanted to eat. And I called Daniel once just to hear his voice and tell him without telling him that things were progressing. I gave Celeste no answer. I let her wait. Because she had given me a deadline, and deadlines are meant to create pressure, and the thing about pressure is that it has to go somewhere. I understood that if I stayed quiet long enough, the pressure would eventually build in her instead of in me. I was right. She called on day 21. Margaret, tighter than before. The warmth turned down. I haven't heard from you. No, I agreed. You haven't. You have 9 days. I know, I said pleasantly. I'd like to know what you're planning. A beat. I think you owe us that. Oh, an interesting word. You'll know when the time is right, I said. I'd like to have you all to dinner again, before the 30 days are up. Would 2 weeks from Saturday work? A pause, calculating. Dinner, she repeated. To give you my answer, I said, in front of the family, since that's how you chose to present your question. Another pause, longer. I could almost hear her deciding whether this was retreat, surrender, or something else. Whether accepting meant winning or walking into something. Her pride won. It always did. Fine, she said. 2 weeks from Saturday. I thanked her and hung up and wrote the date in my notebook. Dinner, Saturday, the 18th. Then underneath it, I wrote what I had been building toward for 3 weeks. What I had known, on some level, from the moment she'd said 30 days at my husband's memorial table, and I had felt that cold, clear, quiet certainty settle into my chest like something finally clicking into place. I wrote, The Reckoning. Outside the window, the oak tree stood tall in the spring afternoon. 30 years of growth. Roots deep enough now that no amount of pulling would move it, just like me, just like this house. Just like the truth that was sitting in a folder on my desk, patient and quiet and completely, devastatingly complete. They had 30 days to move me out. I had 30 days to be ready, and I was ready. The apartment was mine from before the marriage. That surprised people sometimes, that I had kept it. Richard and I had moved into the estate together in 1983, but I had never let go of the small two-bedroom on Clement Street that I'd rented in my 20s and eventually bought outright in 1979 with money I earned myself, before Richard, before the family business, before any of it. It had sat quietly for 4 decades, rented to a series of tenants who'd treated it well enough, generating a small, steady income that went into an account I'd kept in my name alone because Richard had insisted on it. Every woman needs her own account, Maggie. Don't let anyone tell you different. And that I had never touched. When Daniel asked me, 2 days after the memorial dinner, where I was planning to go if I actually moved out of the estate, I told him not to worry. He'd looked at me like I was either very brave or not quite understanding the situation. I understood the situation perfectly. I just understood more of it than he did. The apartment on Clement Street was where I went to work. Not to live, I had no intention of leaving my home, but to think. To spread things out without the feeling that I was in the place being contested. There's something about working in a neutral space, somewhere with no history of other people's arguments in the walls, that lets you see clearly. I drove there on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after Sandra Park's phone call, with 2 cardboard boxes of files and a thermos of coffee, and the particular focus of a woman who has decided to understand everything before she does anything. The apartment smelled like other people's lives, faint and harmless. The current tenant had moved out in January and I hadn't re-rented it yet, some instinct having told me to wait. The rooms were empty except for the old furniture I'd never quite removed. A kitchen table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf with a few paperbacks left behind. It looked like a place between things. It felt right. I sat up at the kitchen table and I began. The files I had were not complete. I knew that. Sandra was working on the full forensic picture, but what I had access to on my own, the records I could pull from my quiet, overlooked position as a dormant board member of Hale Family Properties, was already enough to make a person feel sick. I had been looking at these numbers for months in the back of my mind, turning them over, not quite believing what they seemed to be saying, the way you don't quite believe something you don't want to believe, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of you. Sitting at that kitchen table on Clement Street, I forced myself to believe it. The first thing I spread out was a set of invoices from a company called Meridian Facilities Group. They appeared in the business records beginning in 2019, billing Hale Family Properties for maintenance and consulting services on several of the commercial properties the company managed. The invoices were professional looking. The amounts were not outrageous, the kind of numbers that would pass a casual review without setting off alarms. But when I cross-referenced them against our actual property maintenance logs, which I had because Richard had given me full access to everything, and that access had simply never been revoked, the services billed did not consistently match the services performed. Some matched, enough to make it look legitimate. But there were months, 6, 7, 8 months in a row, where Meridian Facilities Group billed us for work that either happened at a much smaller scale or didn't happen at all. I wrote the total discrepancy for Meridian alone in my notebook. Then I turned to the second set of documents. A company called Brentwood Advisory Partners. Similar pattern. Appeared in 2020, billed for strategic consulting. The amounts reasonable enough to avoid scrutiny. The actual services vague enough to be almost impossible to verify. I found the incorporation documents for Brentwood through a public records search I'd done from my phone in the car one afternoon, pretending to myself that I was just curious, pretending it was nothing. The registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. The listed officers were names I didn't know. But I knew how to look at corporate structures after 4 decades of being married to a man who explained them to me. And I knew what it looked like when a company existed primarily on paper. I wrote the Brentwood total underneath the Meridian total. By noon, I had 5 company names on my list, 5 shells, 5 fictions, 5 sets of invoices billing a real company for services that were either inflated beyond recognition or invented wholesale. I sat back in my chair and looked at the kitchen ceiling of my old apartment, and I did the arithmetic in my head. The rough arithmetic, the incomplete arithmetic. Sandra would have the real numbers. But even the rough version made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my conscience. Because here's the thing that I kept returning to, the thing that cut deeper than any of the money. The family business was not just Richard's. It had never been just Richard's, despite what anyone, including, I think, Ethan, had come to believe. It had been built by both of us, in the particular way that things get built by couples where one person is visible and the other is not. Richard was the name on the door. He shook the hands and signed the checks and gave the interviews when there were interviews to give. But I was there at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night when the contracts needed reviewing. I was there when the hard decisions needed to be made about which properties to sell and which to hold. I was the one who'd argued, in 2009, against expanding into a commercial market that had looked attractive but smelled wrong to me, and been proven right 18 months later when that market collapsed and took 3 of our competitors with it. The business existed because of both of us, and someone had been stealing from it like it was a cookie jar left unattended. I refilled my coffee and kept working. The thing about documents is that they talk to each other once you know what you're looking for. A payment date on one invoice matches a transfer date on a bank statement. A consulting fee from one shell company corresponds almost exactly to a personal expense recorded under a different account. The story starts to become visible. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way that shapes emerge from fog when you drive through it slowly enough. What I was building, piece by piece in that empty apartment, was a timeline. And the timeline told a story that made my throat tight and my hands very still on the table. It had started small. That was the pattern Sandra had described. It almost always started small. A few inflated invoices here, a modest disbursement there, testing the water, seeing if anyone noticed. And no one had noticed because the person who would have noticed, who had always noticed, who had a nearly infallible sense for when numbers were wrong, had been sitting in a dark house grieving her husband for 2 years, barely looking at the mail. They had started in earnest about 8 months after Richard's funeral. I sat with that for a long time. 8 months after I buried him. 8 months after I stood at a graveside in November rain and tried to understand what my life was going to look like now. They had waited, whether out of some residual caution or some fragment of decency, I couldn't say, and then they had begun. I thought about Ethan, my eldest son, the one who looked like Richard and moved like Richard and had, for a significant portion of his childhood, been exactly the kind of boy that makes you believe everything is going to be all right. He had been gentle as a kid, patient with his younger brother in the way that firstborns sometimes are. He'd come to me when he was 16 with a problem he was ashamed of, and I had sat with him at this very kitchen table, this table in this apartment, before we moved it to the estate, and told him that the measure of a person was not whether they made mistakes but how they faced them. I wondered if he remembered that conversation. I wondered if he had thought about it in those 8 months when he was signing off on disbursements to companies that didn't really exist. I wrote his name in my notebook. Then I sat looking at it for a while. Then I wrote beneath it, he knew what he was doing. He always knew. And that was perhaps the part that hurt most of all. Not Celeste's calculation or her ambition or her cold-handed manipulation of my son. Those qualities, while ugly, were at least consistent. Celeste had always been exactly what she was. No, what hurt was Ethan. What hurt was that my son, my firstborn, Richard's boy, had looked at what they were building together and had said yes, had kept saying yes, had sat at a memorial dinner for his father and stayed silent while his wife tried to push his mother out the door, and the silence was not just cowardice, it was complicity. I closed the notebook. Outside the window, a city bus went by. Someone's dog was barking somewhere. The ordinary sounds of a Wednesday in the world where nothing unusual was happening, which is most of the world, most of the time, regardless of what any particular person is sitting with at their kitchen table. I called Sandra. "Where are we?" I asked. "Making progress," she said. I found a third entity, beyond the 2 you identified, something called Pacific Rim Consultants. Much smaller, older, goes back to 2018. "Before Richard died," I said. A brief pause. "Yes." I absorbed that. Before Richard died, which meant either it had started while he was alive, which seemed nearly impossible because Richard would have found it, or it had been set up in advance, a structure prepared and waiting, and activated after his death. Which is more likely? I asked. Based on the transaction patterns? The latter, Sandra said. The structure looks like it was built for future use. There are companies that do this kind of thing. Set up the mechanism first, use it later. It's cleaner, harder to trace back. I thought about what that meant. Planning. Not a desperate improvisation, not someone falling into temptation in a moment of weakness. planning. Before the death, when the death was not yet certain, but perhaps, in the mind of someone thinking ahead, inevitable, the way all deaths are eventually inevitable. Sandra, I said, when you have the complete report, everything, all 5 companies, every dollar, I want it to be bulletproof. It will be, she said. I'm not asking for close enough. I need bulletproof. Mrs. Hale. Her voice was patient and firm in equal measure. I understand what's at stake. I've done this 14 times. It will be bulletproof. I thanked her and hung up. The afternoon light was moving through the apartment windows in long yellow bars, dust in the air, the smell of old wood and other people's years. I sat in it and I let myself, for exactly 5 minutes, feel everything I had been keeping very carefully behind the wall of my purpose. The grief, first, not the grief for Richard, which was a constant and almost familiar ache by now, but a fresher grief. The grief for the version of Ethan I had believed in, for the dinners we'd had together as a family, the ones that had felt real, even if, apparently, they had not been quite as real as I thought, for the ease of not knowing this. Because there is a specific loss in the moment you know something you cannot unknow. And then the anger. I let that in too because it was honest and it deserved its moment. Not the hot, explosive kind. I had never been much for that. But the steady, cold kind. The kind that sits in your chest like iron and doesn't move. They had used my grief as a cover story. They had banked on me being too devastated, too diminished, too much the grieving widow to look at what was happening to something Richard and I had built together over 40 years. They had used my pain as a tool. 5 minutes. Then I put it away. Not because it wasn't valid, but because it wasn't useful, not right now, and I had more work to do. I picked up my pen and turned to a fresh page in the notebook. At the top of the page I wrote, "What they don't know I have." Then I began to list it. The property deed. The trust documents Richard had updated in 2018, which I had also found in the metal box, and which I had not yet shown to William, but would, on Tuesday, when I brought everything together. Letters. Correspondence. The particular paper trail of a marriage that had always, whatever its complications, been a genuine partnership. Celeste had done her research. She'd done it well, actually. She'd identified the right target, built the right pressure, chosen the right moment. She had looked at a 64-year-old widow and seen a problem she could solve. But she had researched the widow without researching the marriage. And the marriage was where everything lived. I had one more document to find. Richard had mentioned it once, maybe 8 years ago, in the way he mentioned important things, casually, in passing, as though it were obvious rather than significant. We had been in the study, both of us working, a quiet Sunday afternoon, and he had looked up from whatever he was reading and said, "I wrote you a letter, Maggie. It's in the box, the metal one. Don't read it until you have to." I had said, "Why would I have to?" He had looked at me in the way he sometimes did, the particular look that meant he was seeing something I wasn't seeing yet, that his mind had gone somewhere practical while mine had stayed in the comfortable present. "Just don't read it until you have to," he said again, and went back to his reading. I had not read it. Not when he died. Not in the 2 years since. I had opened the metal box 4 times and seen the envelope with my name on it in his handwriting and closed the box each time without taking it out. I had told myself this was because I wasn't ready, and maybe that had been true for a while. But I also think, somewhere underneath the grief, I had understood on some level that the letter was not for the bad days. The bad days were for living through, which I had done, imperfectly and without grace at times, but lived through. The letter was for something specific, something Richard had anticipated, and I had not yet arrived at. I thought I had arrived at it now. I drove back to the estate that evening as the sun was going down, the hills orange and the sky going purple at the edges, the old Volvo moving through the light like it had been doing it for years and intended to do it indefinitely. I went inside. I went to the study. I opened the metal box. I took out the envelope, his handwriting on the front, Margaret, just that, no last name, as though there could be any other Margaret in the world this was meant for. The letters slightly uneven because he'd written quickly, the way he always did, the way his mind moved faster than his hand. I sat at his desk. I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, dated October 2019, 3 years before he died. He had known something 3 years before he died, had felt something, anticipated something, the particular sixth sense of a man who had spent a lifetime reading people and situations and had learned to trust what he read. I will not reproduce everything he wrote. It was private. It was his, and it was mine, and it belongs to us in the way that some things just do, beyond any legal document or public record. But I will tell you this. Richard had seen it coming, not the specific shape of it, not the shell companies, not the ultimatum at the memorial dinner, but the underlying dynamic. The way ambition can hollow out a person, the way proximity to money changes people in ways they don't always notice until it's too late. He had written about Ethan with a heartbreak that was all the more devastating for being so careful, so measured, the love of a father who sees his child clearly and loves him anyway and is afraid. He had written about me at the end in a way that made me stop reading for a while and look out the window at the dark garden until I could breathe correctly again. "You've always been the foundation," he wrote. "Not because I needed you to be, but because you chose to be. And foundations don't get noticed until someone starts trying to build on something that isn't solid enough to hold them. If that ever happens, Maggie, if anyone ever tries to move you from the ground you're standing on, I want them to find out what I always knew, that you are not movable, that you never were." The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a nightbird started up. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I held the envelope for a moment, just held it, the way you hold something that is both an ending and a beginning. Then I put it in the folder with the deed and the trust amendments and the list in my notebook and Sandra's preliminary findings, and I understood that the case was almost complete. I understood that within 2 weeks, I would have everything I needed. And I understood, sitting alone in my husband's study in the house that was mine, that what was coming was not revenge. Revenge was Celeste's currency. Hot and personal, and ultimately about ego. What I was building was something else, colder, more lasting, the kind of reckoning that doesn't announce itself until it's already finished. I called William that night. "The letter," I said. "Richard wrote me a letter, dated 2019. Witnessed?" I heard papers shuffling. "Witnessed and notarized," William said. "He brought it to me himself. I have a copy in our files. I've had it for 6 years. A pause. "He told me you'd call when it was time." I sat very still. He knew I'd call. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, Margaret, he said, "She'll know when she needs it. She always knows." The room was very quiet. The clock, the nightbird, the dark garden. "He was right," I said finally. "He usually was," William said, "about you especially." I didn't cry. I had already moved past the part of this where crying was the right response. What I felt instead was something complicated, a love that had not diminished by being tested by absence, a gratitude that had no clean or easy shape, and beneath it all the cold, clear iron of my purpose. 2 weeks, William, I said. Prepare everything, the deed, the trust, the letter, and whatever Sandra has by then. I paused. All of it goes on the table at once. Understood, he said. And the dinner? You're sure about the format? I'm sure, I said. They chose to do it publicly. I'm choosing to finish it the same way. After I hung up, I sat at Richard's desk in the quiet house for a long time. Not planning anymore, Chet. I had done enough planning. Not grieving. I was through with that for the night. Just sitting, being in the house the way you can only be when you know it's yours, when you know its sounds and its silences and the particular quality of its dark. 30 days. Celeste had given me 30 days. She had meant it as a countdown. I had used it as a runway. And I was almost ready to take off. The Saturday arrived the way significant days always do, quietly, without drama in the weather or the light, as though the world hadn't gotten the memo about what was scheduled to happen inside this house. I was up at 5, not because I couldn't sleep. I had slept solidly, which surprised me until I thought about it and understood that my body had finally accepted what my mind had already decided. There is a particular rest that comes when you stop fighting the current and start moving with it deliberately. I had been fighting for 2 years without knowing I was fighting. Now I was done fighting. Now I was doing something else entirely. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden come up out of the dark slowly. the shapes of things becoming themselves again as the light increased. The oak tree first. It was always the first thing visible, tall enough to catch the earliest light before anything else. Then the rose beds, still working on their spring recovery, more stems than blooms, but the buds coming. Then the stone path Richard had laid himself one summer in the 90s, badly at first, and then better as he learned, the stones near the gate still slightly uneven, in a way I had never fixed because I liked the imperfection, because it was his. I had set the table the night before, the good china again, same as the memorial dinner. I had done this deliberately, consciously. If Celeste recognized the parallel, good. If she didn't, that was fine too. The table was set for 12. William would be there and Sandra, in their capacity as my legal and financial advisors, a detail I had mentioned to Celeste only as a couple of colleagues I'd like present. Thomas, Richard's cousin. Margaret Forsythe, because she had been at the first dinner and deserved to see the end of what had begun there. Daniel and Paula. And Ethan and Celeste, of course, the guests of honor. The ones who had called this whole thing into being without understanding what they were calling. I had also called, 3 days earlier, a woman named Diane Cho, a notary public who had worked with William's firm for years and who had agreed, without being told specifics, to be available on Saturday evening. She would sit quietly at the far end of the table, her credentials present and ready, because some of what needed to happen required a witness whose presence was official. Every piece in place. I spent the morning cooking, the same way I had for the memorial dinner, because some things deserve the full weight of your attention, and because the physical work of it, the chopping, the timing, the management of heat and smell and texture, kept me inside my body instead of inside my head, which was where I needed to be. Present, grounded, not running scenarios, just here in this kitchen, making food for people who would sit at this table in a few hours and find out who they actually were. Around 11, Daniel called. "Mom, today's the day." "Today's the day," I confirmed. "And you still won't tell me what's in those folders." "You'll see it when everyone sees it." A silence. Then, "Are you scared?" I considered the question honestly, the way he deserved. "No," I said. I think I was scared for a while, in the beginning, not of them specifically, of what I was going to find out, of what it was going to mean to know it. I paused, but I'm past that now. "Mom," he said, and his voice had something in it, something stripped down, something younger than 42. "Whatever happens today, I need you to know that I'm on your side, unconditionally, whatever you decide." My throat tightened, not quite tears, something adjacent to them. "I know that," I said. "I've always known that." "Okay," he cleared his throat. "What time should we be there?" 6 o'clock. "We'll be there at 5:30. He would too. That was Daniel. Always early, always steady, always the one you could count on to actually show up. I had 2 sons, and I had loved them both equally, or tried to. But standing in my kitchen that morning, I understood that equal love does not produce equal people, and that the failures of one child do not diminish the gifts of another. Sandra called at noon. "Report is finalized," she said. "I'll have the physical copies with me tonight. William has reviewed everything and signed off." A brief pause. "Mrs. Hale, the final number is $438,000. $438,000. I set down the wooden spoon I was holding and stood very still for a moment, my hand on the counter. I had known the number was significant. Sandra had told me hundreds of thousands, and I had prepared myself for something in that range. But hearing the specific number, the precise, documented, forensically verified number, made it real in a way that hundreds of thousands had not quite managed. "Over what period?" I asked. 31 months, she said. From 6 months after Mr. Hale's death to approximately 3 weeks ago. The activity stopped around the time of the memorial dinner. Another pause. Which suggests they may have anticipated some level of scrutiny following the conversation that evening. Or they thought they'd already won and didn't need to keep going. Or they got nervous when I didn't crumble the way they'd expected. I wasn't sure which, and it didn't really matter. Authorization signatures, I asked. "Both of them on every significant transaction," Sandra said. "Ethan as managing director, Celeste as co-signatory on the operational account, a role she was added to in early 2022, 8 months after Mr. Hale's death. 8 months after his death. Right on schedule. Thank you, I said, for everything. I know this was beyond what I initially described. It was exactly what I described I'd do, she said simply. See you tonight. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and let the number settle into me. $438,000. From a business Richard and I had built. 41 years of decisions and risks and the particular grind of building something real. Money that belonged to the business that should have been reinvested or distributed properly or held in reserve, not funneled through shell companies into personal accounts, while his widow sat in a dark house not looking at the mail. I picked up the wooden spoon and went back to cooking, because what else was there to do? They began arriving at 6. Margaret Frozeℹ arrived first, which I hadn't expected, driven by her granddaughter who helped her to the door and was politely declined when she offered to stay. The old woman came inside slowly, took in the set table and the legal folders at my place setting, and the two professional strangers, William and Sandra, already seated with their briefcases, and she looked at me with those dark, ancient, perfectly clear eyes and said, "Good girl." That was all she said. It was enough. Thomas came next, then Daniel and Paula. Daniel hugging me tightly for a moment at the door, saying nothing, letting go. William and Sandra had settled into their seats with the quiet professional gravity of people who had done difficult things before and were prepared to do them again. Celeste and Ethan were last. 7 minutes past 6, which I suspected was deliberate. Celeste had always had a preference for arriving after the room was assembled, for walking into the scene rather than waiting for it. She came in wearing a dark blazer over a cream blouse, put together, controlled, carrying her slim portfolio again. This detail caught at something in me. She'd brought the portfolio. She was still planning to negotiate. Even now, even tonight, she still thought this was a negotiation. Ethan came in behind her. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. The circles under his eyes were darker than they'd been at the memorial dinner, and he had the specific look of someone who is managing a low level of constant fear. The careful movements, the eyes that checked the room too quickly when he entered. He saw William. His jaw tightened slightly. He saw Sandra. Something crossed his face. Quick. Almost imperceptible. But I was watching for it, and I caught it. Recognition. Not of her specifically, maybe, but of what she represented. The kind of person she was. The kind of work she did. He'd been in business long enough to recognize a forensic accountant when he saw one sitting at a dinner table with a briefcase. He looked at me. I gave him a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just, yes, this is what this is. His color changed. Celeste, to her credit, gave away almost nothing. She kissed my cheeks, left then right, as always, and said, "Margaret, it smells wonderful in here," with the ease of someone who has decided that confidence is armor and is wearing it until the last possible moment. "Celeste," I said pleasantly, "sit wherever you like." She chose a seat near the center of the table, across from Daniel, who looked at her with an expression he was barely keeping civil. Ethan sat beside her, his hands on the table in front of him. He didn't reach for the wine when Paula poured it. He just sat. Dinner was served. I had decided, very consciously, to let the meal happen, to not shortcut to the end. Part of this was practical. I wanted everyone settled. I wanted the meal as a shared experience before the table became a courtroom. But part of it was something more deliberate. I wanted Celeste to sit through a full dinner not knowing when it was coming. I wanted her to wait, the way she had made me wait for weeks with her 30-day clock running. We ate. Conversation was careful and sporadic. Thomas made an effort, asking after the grandchildren, which produced a brief and slightly stilted exchange with Paula about the kids' spring sports. Margaret Frozeℹ ate methodically and said very little. Daniel watched Ethan. Ethan watched his plate. Celeste watched me. She was looking for the signal, the moment I would reveal what this was actually about. I gave her nothing. I passed the bread. I asked Thomas about his garden. I asked Sandra, introducing her simply as a colleague, where she'd gone to school, which she answered smoothly, and the answer meant nothing to Celeste because she didn't know who Sandra was yet, but Ethan knew. I could see him knowing more with every passing minute, the food on his plate going mostly untouched. The plates were cleared, coffee was poured, the table settled into the particular quiet of an ending meal. And I looked around at the faces of the people in this room, the ones who had known Richard, the ones who had been part of whatever we had all built together, the ones who had chosen to destroy parts of it, and I felt the weight of the moment without being crushed by it. I placed my hands flat on the table. "I want to thank everyone for coming," I said. "I asked you here to give my answer to the question that was asked at this table 5 weeks ago." I looked directly at Celeste. "About the future of this house, about who has authority here." Celeste met my eyes, steady, composed, still armored. "I'd like to start with this," I said, and I opened the first folder and slid the document across the table to William, who passed a copy to Celeste and a copy to Ethan simultaneously. "This is the deed to this property, recorded with the county in 2003. I'd like everyone to look at the name on the ownership line." The table was quiet. I watched Celeste's eyes move across the page. I watched the specific moment they stopped, the almost invisible pause, a fraction of a second, before her expression reassembled itself. "That's," she began. "My name," I said. "Only my name. It has been only my name for 23 years. I let that land. The house was never jointly owned. It was never part of the family business holdings. It was never at any point a shared family asset in any legal sense. It has always been mine." Celeste set the paper down. "That doesn't necessarily mean—" "I'm not finished," I said quietly. She stopped. I took out the second document. "This is a trust amendment executed in 2018 by Richard, with William present as our attorney. It clarifies explicitly the structure of the family assets and my role as Richard's equal partner in all business decisions. It's legally binding and was filed appropriately." I slid copies across. "And this—" I took out the envelope. "This is a letter, written by Richard in October 2019, witnessed and notarized and held in William's files for 6 years. It was written to me, and I've chosen to read the relevant section aloud because I believe everyone at this table deserves to hear it." The room was completely silent, even Celeste. I unfolded the letter. My hands were steady. I was genuinely surprised by how steady they were. I read the section Richard had written about the house, about his intentions for it, about his understanding of what it represented, about the clarity with which he had structured things specifically to protect what we had built together from anyone who might, in his absence, mistake his widow for something that could be simply moved aside. I read the last lines of that section. "Margaret built this home as much as I did. She made the decisions. She absorbed the failures. She kept the foundation sound when I was too proud or too blind to admit it needed attention. If anyone attempts to treat her as a tenant in her own life, they should know that I saw to it that the ground itself would not cooperate with them." Daniel made a sound. Not quite a word, just a sound. Paula had her hand over her mouth. Thomas had his eyes closed. Margaret Frozeℹ was looking at the candles. Ethan, my son, Richard's boy, had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of him, and his head was bowed, and I could see from the rigid line of his shoulders that he was holding himself together with considerable effort. Celeste was very still. I refolded the letter. I put it away. I took a slow breath. "I have one more thing to share," I said, "and this one is more difficult." I looked at Sandra. She opened her briefcase and produced a bound document. Clean, professional, tabbed. A copy for Celeste. A copy for Ethan. She placed them down without ceremony. "This is a forensic financial report," I said, "prepared by my financial analyst over the past 3 weeks, drawing on business records I had full authorized access to as a board member of Hale Family Properties." I paused. "It documents, in full detail, with source documents attached, the systematic diversion of funds from the family business through 5 fraudulent shell companies over a period of 31 months. Celeste's composure cracked, not shattered. She was too controlled for that. But I saw it, a hairline fracture in the surface. Her eyes moved very fast to Ethan. Ethan didn't look at her. "The total amount identified," I said, and I kept my voice even because I had made a decision to never perform this the way Celeste would have performed it, with venom and triumph, is $438,000. Both your names appear as authorizing signatories on every significant transaction." The room erupted. Thomas stood up, knocking his chair back. 400 what? He turned to Ethan. Is she serious? Ethan, is she serious? Daniel said nothing. He was looking at his brother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something that had passed anger and gone somewhere colder and quieter. Paula took Lily's empty glass from the table and held it without any apparent reason, just needing something to do with her hands. This is... Celeste's voice was controlled, but the edges were fraying. This is completely... You can't just produce a private report and claim, the source documents are attached, Sandra said. It was the first time she'd spoken since dinner began. Her voice was perfectly level, professional. The voice of someone who has presented findings to people who don't want to hear them many times before. Pages 42 through 217, every transaction is itemized with corresponding bank records, corporate filings, and signature authorizations. The methodology is outlined in the executive summary. She paused. You're welcome to have your own accountant review the report. The numbers will not change. Silence fell over the room like something physical. Celeste set her copy of the report down very carefully. She looked at me. And for the first time, the absolute first time in 15 years of knowing this woman, I saw something in her eyes that was not calculation. Something undefended. Something close to fear. Margaret, she said. And her voice was different, smaller. Whatever you think you found, I want you to know that everything Ethan and I did was for the family, for the future. The business needed restructuring, and the conventional channels were... Celeste. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Stop. She stopped. Don't tell me it was for the family, I said. Don't sit at this table and tell me that stealing from something Richard built for 40 years was an act of love for his family. I won't carry that insult quietly. I held her gaze. You targeted a grieving woman because you believed grief had made me useless. You constructed a financial mechanism to extract money from a company you did not build and did not own. And then you came to this table, his table, and tried to remove the one person who might eventually look closely enough to find it. I paused. I need you to acknowledge that. Not for me, because it's true. Celeste said nothing. Ethan made a sound, low, almost inaudible. It was not quite a word. It was the sound of something breaking open inside a person who has been holding something closed for a very long time. Mom. His voice was wrecked. Not yet, I said. I was not ready to hear him yet. I needed to finish. William? William opened his briefcase. He produced 2 more documents, one for Ethan, one for Celeste. These are the formal legal notices, William said, slipping into the practiced calm of a man who has delivered bad news many times and found that clarity is a form of mercy. The first outlines Mrs. Hale's position as sole property owner and the immediate cessation of any claim or pressure regarding the estate. The second initiates the legal process for restitution of the diverted funds, along with the relevant reporting obligations that this evidence triggers under state business law. Celeste picked up this document. Her hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. Ethan didn't touch his copy. He was looking at me with the expression of a man standing at the bottom of something he dug himself, finally understanding the depth of it. How long have you known? He asked. His voice was barely there. I started suspecting before the memorial dinner, I said. I found the financial inconsistencies in October. I didn't know the full shape of it until recently. I looked at him steadily. But I want you to hear something, Ethan. I didn't do this because I hate you. I am your mother. I will be your mother until I'm in the ground. But being your mother does not mean absorbing what you've done without response. It doesn't mean standing aside and pretending this is acceptable because the alternative is hard. My voice did not waver. I was proud of that. Your father taught you better. I know he did, because I was there. Something in Ethan's face came apart. Not all at once. It happened in stages, the way a wall comes down. He pressed one hand over his mouth. His shoulders moved. He was crying, quietly, without theater, the kind of crying that happens when the grief is too specific and too deserved for any performance. Celeste looked at her husband. And for a moment, one moment, just one, I saw something cross her face that might have been regret, or might only have been the recognition that the life she had built on her particular foundations was no longer going to hold. Then it was gone, and she was composed again, or trying to be. What happens now? She said. Not a question, a statement of someone taking inventory. Now, I said, we talk about what comes next. The room was still. The candles had burned lower, the same way they had at the memorial dinner 5 weeks ago. The good china, the Bordeaux, the photographs of Richard on the sideboard behind us all, looking out at the table where so many versions of his family had sat over the years. I straightened in my chair. I had arrived at the part where power, quiet and undramatic and completely certain of itself, simply changed hands. The phrase hung in the air over the dinner table like smoke. What comes next? Celeste had asked it with the controlled voice of someone taking inventory, and I had said we would talk about it, and now the room waited. Thomas had sat back down. Daniel had his hands folded in front of him on the table, very still, watching me with the expression of a man who has decided to trust something even though every instinct in him wants to act. Paula was looking at the tablecloth. Ethan had stopped crying outwardly, but his eyes were red and his hands on the table were not quite steady, and he had the hollowed-out look of a person who has just had something very heavy removed from them. Not pleasantly, not cleanly, but removed nonetheless. Margaret Forsythe was watching me. She had been watching me for most of the evening, and there was something in her 91-year-old gaze that I found unexpectedly steadying. She had seen more of life than anyone else at this table, more loss, more betrayal, more of the particular human capacity for both terrible choices and genuine repair. She was watching me the way you watch something you want to see done right. I looked at Ethan first. I had thought in these weeks of preparation about this moment, about what I wanted to say to my son when the documents were on the table and the room knew what it knew. I had written things in my notebook and crossed them out. I had rehearsed sentences that felt too cold, too practiced, too much like closing arguments. What I came to, in the end, was the understanding that there was no perfect version of this. There was only the honest version. Ethan, I said, I want to give you the chance to speak, not to explain it away, not to defend the structure of what you did. That's William and Sandra's department now, and the lawyers that will follow them, but to speak as my son, if that's something you're still willing to be. He looked up. His eyes were wrecked. I don't know what to say. Start with the truth, I said. You haven't tried that yet tonight. He flinched, just slightly. But he didn't look away this time, which was something. I knew, he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges. I knew what we were doing. I told myself it was... I made up reasons, that the business owed us, that you weren't capable of managing it properly on your own, and the money would just sit there or get wasted, or... He stopped. His jaw worked. Those were excuses. I know they were excuses. I knew at the time. He pressed his hand flat on the table. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that we'd pay it back, that nobody would get hurt. Somebody got hurt, Daniel said flatly from across the table. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to his brother since they'd arrived. Mom got hurt. Dad's company got hurt. Did you forget that the business was Dad's whole life's work? Or did you just decide that didn't matter? Daniel, I said. No. Daniel's voice was tight and quiet and controlled in the way that means a person is very close to not being controlled. I need him to hear that. He needs to actually hear it. He heard it, I said, because Ethan had. I could see it. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't constructing a new excuse on the fly. He was sitting in it, which was not nothing. It was not enough, not even close to enough, but it was not nothing. Celeste cleared her throat. Every head at the table turned toward her with the specific attention you give to something you've been waiting to hear and are not sure you want to. She had been quiet since William presented the notices. She had read through the forensic report, or portions of it, with the focused expression of someone looking for errors, for gaps, for something she could use. I had watched her doing it from across the table, and the particular quality of her stillness as she'd worked through the pages had told me what I needed to know. She hadn't found anything to work with. Now she set the report down. I want to be clear, she said. Her voice was back to its usual register, measured, precise, careful. Whatever had cracked at the moment of revelation had been resealed. I reject the characterization of what we did as theft. The business decisions made were complex, and the structure used was one that has legal precedence in Celeste. William's voice was patient and completely firm. I'd strongly recommend that you not make any characterizations about the legality of what's documented in that report without your own attorney present. Tonight is not the appropriate venue for that discussion." She looked at him. A beat. "Fine." She set her hands in her lap. "What exactly are you proposing, Margaret?" And here was the moment. The one I had been building toward for 5 weeks. The one I had rehearsed not as a performance, but as a decision, over and over, in the study, in the apartment on Clement Street, in the garden, testing it against different versions of myself to find the one that was most fully me. I had decided something very specific about what I was and was not willing to be tonight. I was not willing to be cruel. Not because I didn't have cause, I had cause, considerable cause, but because cruelty was not the point. Cruelty was Celeste's currency, and I refused to trade in it. The satisfaction of a well-delivered blow had never interested me the way it interested some people. What interested me was the truth being out, and the structure being corrected, and the people in this room understanding what had happened and what it meant. But I was also not willing to be weak. Not tonight. Not after what had been done. What I wanted was justice, the actual thing, not a performance of it. "Ethan," I said, "you will resign your position as managing director of Hale Family Properties, effective immediately. William has the paperwork." I looked at my son steadily. "I am not removing you from the family. I am removing you from a position of authority over something you have demonstrated you cannot be trusted with. Those are not the same thing." Ethan nodded. Once. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. Something in the nod, the rawness of it, the lack of performance, told me that on some level he had known this was coming. Maybe had known it was right. "The $438,000 will be repaid in full," I continued. "William and your attorney will work out a structure. I am not requiring it all at once. I understand that's not realistic. But there will be a binding repayment agreement, documented and enforceable, and there will be no renegotiation of that number." Celeste opened her mouth. "I said there will be no renegotiation," I said, and something in my tone, not anger, not volume, just absolute and complete certainty, closed her mouth again. "The amount is documented. It is what it is." I let a moment pass. "The house," I said, and the room, which had been quiet, became quieter still. Even the candles seemed to stop moving. "This house, my house, is not for discussion. It is not a family asset to be managed or reallocated or transferred. It is mine. I will live here for as long as I choose to live here, and when I am ready to make decisions about its future, I will make those decisions. Not because someone gave me an ultimatum, because it is mine, and that is my right." I looked at Celeste very directly. "You told me I had 30 days to leave this house. You said it at this table, in front of these people, 2 months after my husband's grave had finished settling." She held my gaze. She was working very hard at composure and mostly achieving it, but I could see the effort. "I am giving you 72 hours, I said. Complete silence. "To remove your personal belongings from the guest suite you have been using as an office." I had learned, through William, that Celeste had been slowly establishing a physical presence in the estate, using the third-floor guest suite for client meetings, storing files there. The kind of incremental occupation that happens when someone is planning a transition and getting comfortable before the official announcement. 72 hours. The same energy you brought to this table, I am returning to you now. Not because I enjoy it, because you need to understand that the actions you take have weight, that they come back. The room was so still I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway. Celeste looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the table. It was not submission, exactly. I don't think Celeste was built for submission. It was more like recalibration. The specific internal adjustment of a person who has just had the ground shift under them and is figuring out what solid looks like now. Thomas let out a long breath. "Lord," he said, and then caught himself and said nothing else. Margaret Forsythe made a sound that might have been approval. Daniel unclenched his hands. It was Ethan who spoke next. He looked up from the table, and his eyes were still red and his voice was still rough, but there was something in his posture that had shifted, some minor reorganization that reminded me, painfully, of his father. Richard had had the same thing, the ability to become more himself, somehow, in the moments of most pressure, rather than less. "Mom," he said, "I owe you something that I don't know how to say." Then don't try to say it tonight, I said quietly. Tonight isn't the time. I need to... He stopped, started again. I need you to know that Celeste didn't... She didn't push me into this against my will. I want you to understand that. I made choices. I'm not... He looked at his wife briefly and then back at me. I'm not going to let her carry this alone because it's easier for me. I was there. I signed things. I knew. Celeste looked at him. I couldn't fully read her expression. It was complicated, layered, the expression of someone watching a person they have depended on do something unexpected. Whether she respected it or resented it, I genuinely couldn't tell. I appreciate that, I said, and I meant it. It was not forgiveness, so we were nowhere near forgiveness, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But it was something. The smallest beginning of something that might, over a very long time and with a great deal of difficult work, become something more. What happens with... Ethan hesitated. The legal side, the reporting, are you going to... William will explain the obligations, I said. Some things are out of my hands. The report exists. Certain disclosures are required. I don't have the option to simply set that aside. I paused. I also wouldn't set it aside if I could. What was done needs to have consequences. That's not punishment. That's just how things work. He nodded again. Still no argument. I watched him absorbing it, really absorbing it, not looking for a way around it. And I thought, there's some of Richard in there still. It's buried under 30 years of choices and Celeste's architecture and his own fear, but it's in there. Whether he could get back to it was not something I could answer. That was his work, not mine. Paula got up quietly and went to the kitchen. I heard the sound of water running, the familiar small noise of someone who doesn't know what to do with themselves, finding something practical to do with their hands. She came back with a glass of water and set it in front of Ethan without a word. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understands, maybe for the first time that evening, that the damage is wider than just the table in front of him. Daniel, I said. My younger son looked at me. I'd like you to take on a more formal role in the business going forward. Not immediately. Not while all of this is being sorted out. But when the dust settles, I don't want to leave the company without family leadership that I trust. I looked at him steadily. That's you. It's always been you in some ways. You just never had the room, Something moved across Daniel's face. Not quite what I expected. Not just relief or pride. Something more complicated. The look of a person being handed something they had quietly wanted for a long time and finding that they didn't feel entirely good about getting it this way. Mom, he said carefully, I don't want to take anything from Ethan. You're not taking anything from Ethan, I said. Ethan made his choices. This is about what happens now. I paused. You can say no. He looked at Paula. She gave him a small nod. Not pushing, just present. He looked at me. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, I said. William quietly collected the signed resignation paperwork from Ethan. He'd signed it during a lull in the conversation, without ceremony, the pen moving across the line like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Diane, the notary, witnessed and stamped. The transaction was done. No courtroom, no theatrical confrontation. Just a man who had failed at something, signing his name to the acknowledgement of it. The dinner table began to break apart slowly, the way things do when the energy of a contained space finally releases. Thomas hugged me at the door and said, Richard he'd be a lot of things about tonight, but mostly proud. I thanked him and didn't trust myself to say much more than that. Margaret Forsythe waited until nearly everyone else had gone. Her granddaughter had come back to collect her, and the old woman stood in the hallway with her coat on and looked at me for a moment with those clear, patient eyes. I've been watching families do this to each other for 70 years, she said. It usually ends worse. It's not ended yet, I said honestly. No, she agreed, but you held the line where it mattered. That's rarer than you think. She patted my hand once, dry and warm and firm. Get some rest. Celeste left without speaking to me again. She and Ethan went together, not warmly, not with the ease of people who are in agreement, but together. I watched from the window as they got into their car. I don't know what passed between them on that drive home. I don't know what Celeste said to her husband when the performance was no longer necessary, and it was just the two of them in the dark. I knew what I hoped, that she found something in herself that was more than strategy and ambition and the cold mathematics of position. But I was 64 years old, and I had been paying attention to people for most of those years, and I understood the difference between what I hoped and what I expected. Daniel was the last to leave. He helped me carry the remaining dishes to the kitchen, moving around the space with the particular ease of someone who grew up in a kitchen and never quite lost the muscle memory of it. We washed dishes together for a while without talking much, which was one of the things I had always loved about Daniel. He understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can say is nothing at all. "You okay?" he said finally. "I'm tired," I said. Which was true. I was very tired. Not the frightened, hollow tired of the weeks after Richard died, when sleep felt like a forfeit and waking felt like a burden. The other kind. The earned kind. "What you did tonight," he said, setting a pot on the drying rack. "The way you did it." He shook his head slightly, looking for the words. "It wasn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. More anger, maybe? More of a scene." "Anger would have felt good for about 30 seconds, I said, and then it would have been about my anger instead of about the truth. I didn't want the night to be about my feelings. I handed him the last pan. "The truth is enough on its own. It doesn't need me to dress it up." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Dad said something like that once, about a contract dispute. He said the facts were the drama. You didn't need to add any." I smiled. Came up from somewhere genuine, not performed, not summoned for the occasion, just real. "He stole that from me," I said. "That was originally mine." Daniel laughed. It was short, a little rough. The laugh of someone who has been through a long night and is surfacing, but it was real too. He hugged me at the door for a long time, and I let him, because I needed it, and he needed it, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Then he went home to his family, and the house was quiet again, and mine. I went back to the dining room. I stood in the doorway and looked at what remained. The good china, the wine glasses with their rings, the candles guttered to stubs in their silver holders, Richard's candlesticks from Portugal, still slightly ugly and completely perfect. The copies of the forensic report still sitting where Ethan and Celeste had left them, the pages slightly disarranged from being read quickly and with fear. I picked up Ethan's copy and looked at it for a moment. $438,000. 31 months. 5 shell companies. All documented, all real. I set it down. I looked at Richard's photograph on the sideboard, the one from the year we built the garden, him in dirt-stained jeans with a seedling in each hand, squinting at the camera because the sun was behind me, laughing at something I'd said that neither of us could now remember. "I think that went about as well as it could have," I told him. The clock in the hallway ticked. The house was quiet. I began to clear the table, not because it needed to be done immediately, not because I was avoiding something, but because this was my house. This was my table, and I had been clearing it after difficult evenings for 41 years, and there was something in the continuity of that, in the ordinary physical act of carrying plates and folding linens and blowing out the last of the candles, that felt like a reclaiming of something, not of what had been taken. That was being addressed in its own way through proper channels, with proper documentation, by people who knew what they were doing, but of myself, of the version of Margaret Hale who had existed before grief made her small, before an ultimatum at her own dinner table had briefly threatened to make her smaller. The version who had helped build a company and a home and a family with a good man, and had made 1,000 decisions that nobody put her name on, and had been the foundation without anyone noticing that foundations are the whole point. She had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to be visible again. The candles out, the table bare, the house in its nighttime quiet. I turned off the dining room light. I went to bed. I slept. The morning after the second dinner, I woke up and lay in bed for a long time, just listening to the house, not looking for anything, not running through lists or legal timelines or the particular architecture of what still needed to be done. Just listening. The way you listen to something when you've almost lost it and then didn't, when the proximity to loss has made you more attentive to what remains. The sound of the oak tree moving outside the window. The settling noises of old walls and old wood that I knew so well by now, I could read them like a language. That particular creak meant the upstairs hallway. That one meant the kitchen. This deep resonance meant the house itself breathing, adjusting, continuing. I had been in this house for 41 years. I had cooked approximately 15,000 meals in its kitchen. I had raised 2 sons in its rooms, both of them difficult in their own specific ways, both of them more than the sum of their failures and their gifts. I had fought with Richard in its hallways and made up with him in its garden and watched him slow down in his last years and tried not to let him see how much it frightened me. I had held his hand at the end of a Tuesday afternoon while the paramedics said words that I heard but could not quite absorb. And then I had sat alone in this house for 2 years learning how to be a person inside a silence where another person used to be. This house had held all of it, and somebody had tried to take it from me because they thought I was finished. Because they looked at a woman who had gone quiet with grief and decided that quiet meant empty, decided that a 64-year-old widow was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. I thought about that as I lay there in the morning light. I thought about how many women there are out there in the world who get made small by the people who are supposed to love them. Not always dramatically, not always with ultimatums at dinner tables and forensic accountants and legal notices. Sometimes just slowly, over years, in the accumulation of small dismissals. You don't need to understand this. Let us handle it. You're not capable of, and the women absorb it. Because love is complicated and families are complicated, and sometimes it feels easier to be smaller than to fight for your full size. I had done some of that myself. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story about a perfect woman who never made mistakes. I had stayed quiet in rooms where I should have spoken. I had let decisions happen around me when I should have been at the table. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. But because I had told myself for years that the quiet work was enough. That being the foundation was enough even if nobody saw the foundation. But here's what I had learned in the 5 weeks between one dinner and another. Being the foundation is only enough if you know you're the foundation. If you forget, if you let enough years of other people's certainty convince you that you are something less than what you are, then the people standing on top of you will eventually mistake the ground beneath their feet for something they own. And that is when the reckoning becomes necessary. The repayment agreement was signed 3 weeks after the dinner. I was not present for the signing. I had asked William to handle it, and he did, in a conference room with Ethan's attorney and Sandra's documentation and the particular airless efficiency of legal proceedings that exists specifically because trust has broken down and paperwork is what fills the space where trust used to be. The agreement was binding and structured. Monthly installments over 4 years, with penalties for missed payments, the whole thing filed in a way that gave it teeth. Ethan called me that evening. I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I needed a moment to decide what kind of conversation I was prepared to have. I had spent 4 weeks in the aftermath of the dinner navigating a complicated internal landscape. The grief of it, which was different from the grief of Richard's death, but not entirely unrelated. The two griefs touching each other in ways I hadn't anticipated. Loving a child and being failed by that child is its own specific wound. It doesn't close quickly. It doesn't close neatly. It closes, if it closes, in the way old injuries close, leaving something behind that you learn to live with rather than something that disappears. I answered, "Mom." His voice was quieter than it used to be. Something had changed in it since the dinner. The particular confidence, the assurance that had always sat underneath his words, even in difficult conversations, had shifted into something more careful, more uncertain. I didn't know yet whether that uncertainty was temporary or permanent, whether it was genuine recalibration or just the chastened tone of a man who'd been caught. I wanted to believe the former. I was not yet sure enough to trust the belief. "Ethan," I said, "the agreement is signed." A pause. "I wanted you to hear it from me." "William told me," I said. "Thank you for calling anyway." Silence stretched between us. Not hostile, just wide. The silence of two people standing on either side of something large, figuring out whether there's a way across. "I keep trying to write you a letter," he said finally. "I've started it 4 times. I can't get past the first paragraph without it sounding like an excuse." "Maybe it's not time for a letter yet," I said. "When will it be time?" I thought about that honestly. "I don't know," I said. "I don't have a schedule for this, Ethan. I'm not withholding forgiveness as punishment. I genuinely don't know yet what I'm capable of and when. You'll have to let it be uncertain for a while." He was quiet. Then, "That's fair." "I know it is," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. After we hung up, I sat in the study for a while. Richard's study. Mine now, more fully mine than it had ever been during his lifetime. Because grief has a way of redistributing ownership of things, of spaces, of memories, of the particular textures of a shared life. I had moved my writing desk to face the window where I could see the garden. A small change. It had taken me 2 years to make it. That felt significant, though I couldn't have precisely said why. The question of Celeste was more complicated. I had expected anger from her after the dinner. The specific kind of anger that comes when a person who has never lost discovers what losing feels like. I had steeled myself for messages through attorneys, for retaliatory maneuvering, for some version of the scorched earth response that people like Celeste historically reach for when they find their position untenable. What I got instead was silence. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then William received a brief letter from her attorney acknowledging the terms of the repayment agreement and confirming the removal of her belongings from the estate. Formal, correct, giving nothing away. Then, 5 weeks after the dinner, I received a personal letter. It came in a plain envelope, handwritten address, no return. I recognized her handwriting. I had seen it on cards over 15 years, birthday greetings and holiday notes written with Celeste's characteristic precision, every letter formed as though penmanship were a form of control. I sat with the unopened envelope for a full day before I read it. The letter was 2 pages. I will not reproduce it in full because even Celeste deserves some privacy in her most unguarded moments, and because whatever she is still the mother of my grandchildren, and I have to live in the same world as her for the foreseeable future. But I will tell you what it was. It was not an apology. Not quite. It was something more complicated than an apology, and less satisfying than one. It was an explanation, not of the financial crimes, she didn't go there, but of herself, of how she had grown up in a family where resources were always scarce and always precarious, where the people with money had all the power and the people without it were perpetually at risk, of how marrying into the Hale family had felt, to her, like finally standing on solid ground, of how the terror of losing that solidity had driven her in directions she couldn't now fully defend. There was a line near the end that I read 3 times. I told myself I was protecting our future. I didn't ask myself whose future I was protecting it from. I sat with that for a long time. I did not write back. Not then. I wasn't ready, and I had learned in the past several months to stop forcing readiness when it wasn't there. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I put it in the metal box. The one with Richard's documents. I put it in there not because it belonged with those things, but because the box was where I kept things I wasn't done thinking about yet. Daniel came to dinner on a Sunday in late May. He came alone. Paula had taken the kids to her mother's, a recurring Sunday arrangement, and we ate at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, which felt right. The dining room was for occasions now. The kitchen table was where the ordinary life happened, and ordinary life was what I wanted more of. He had thought about the offer. I hadn't pressed him, hadn't mentioned it again since the dinner, but I'd known he was turning it over, the way Daniel turned things over, methodically, looking at it from each angle, talking to Paula about it at length, because Paula was the person he trusted most in the world, and he had been smart enough to know that from very early in their marriage. "I'll do it," he said, over pasta I had made from a recipe his father loved. "If the terms are right, and if we do it properly, transition period, real oversight, not just putting my name on things." "That's exactly what I want," I said. "I'm not Ethan," he said. "Not bitterly, just clearly. I don't think the same way he does about the business. I'm more cautious. I might make decisions that look slow. Slow decisions made carefully are worth 10 fast ones made badly," I said. "I know that from experience." He looked at me across the table. "Are you going to be involved? In the business?" "Yes," I said. And the simplicity of my own answer surprised me slightly. The absence of hesitation, the absence of the old self-erasure that would have said, "Oh, only if you need me or I don't want to interfere." I've been involved for 40 years. I'm not going to pretend I don't have opinions just because the paperwork didn't reflect it. Daniel smiled. It reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "Honestly, good." We talked for 3 hours that night about the business, about what it needed, about the properties that were underperforming and the ones that had potential and the relationships that needed rebuilding after the uncertainty of the past year. We talked about his children. About Marcus, who was 11 now, and had recently discovered a passion for architecture that made both of us think, simultaneously and without saying it, of Richard. We talked about Ethan carefully, the way you talk about a wound that isn't healed, acknowledging it without pressing on it. At some point, somewhere in the third hour, I looked at my son sitting at my kitchen table, and I understood something that I had known intellectually but not yet felt, that this was what survived. This ordinary evening, this pasta, this conversation, the business being handed forward to someone who would take care of it, the house standing around us, the oak tree outside the window visible even in the dark because I'd left the garden lights on. This was what all of it had been about, underneath the legal documents and the forensic report and the reckoning at the dinner table. Not the drama of it, the continuity, the fact that something Richard and I had built together was going to keep existing, keep being tended by people who understood what it was worth. That mattered more to me than any number Sandra had put in a report. The summer came. The roses in Richard's garden reached the peak of their June extravagance. More blooms than I'd seen in years, the kind of abundance that makes you think the plants have been holding something in reserve and finally decided to spend it. I spent mornings in the garden and found, for the first time since Richard died, that the garden didn't make me sad. It made me present. There is a difference, and it took me 3 summers to find it. Lily, my granddaughter, came to stay for a week in July. She was 9 now, all sharp observations and relentless questions, following me through the garden with a focus that reminded me of someone I used to know. She wanted to know the name of every plant, why this one grew here and not there, why roses had thorns, whether plants could feel things. Some scientists think they respond to stress, I told her, which led to a 20-minute conversation that covered plant biology, whether animals had feelings, and why people were sometimes mean to each other, this last question arriving without transition the way 9-year-old questions do. "Why are people mean to each other?" she asked, looking at a rose bush with the serious expression of someone who has decided this is worth understanding. I thought about the honest answer, about what I actually believed, after 64 years of watching people be various things to each other. "Usually because they're scared," I said, "or because they want something and they haven't figured out a better way to try to get it." "Were you ever mean to someone?" she asked, looking at me directly, the way children do when they want a real answer. "Yes," I said. "Not the same way some people are mean, but I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I let things go on too long. That's its own kind of meanness, even if it looks like nothing." She considered this. "But you fixed it?" "I tried to," I said. "I'm still trying." She seemed to find this acceptable and moved on to asking about aphids, which was a subject I was considerably more expert on. But I stayed with her question for the rest of the day. "But you fixed it?" The honest answer was, partly, imperfectly. In the ways that were within my power to fix, and with the understanding that some things don't get fixed, they get adjusted to. Ethan and I were finding our way to something. Slowly, with long silences and occasional stumbles, a phone call here, a lunch in neutral territory there. He was working with a therapist, which he had told me with the careful delivery of a man who expected judgment and was bracing for it. I had told him that it was one of the better decisions he'd made in recent memory, which was honest and not particularly comforting but seemed to be what he needed. Comfort, I had come to understand, was not always what people actually needed. Sometimes they needed the truth said without cruelty, which is rarer and harder and more useful. Celeste remained peripheral. She and Ethan were still together. I didn't know whether to call that its own kind of reckoning or its own kind of ongoing consequence, and I decided it wasn't really mine to evaluate. She had not reached out again after the letter. I had not reached out to her. The repayment installments arrived on schedule, processed through attorneys, each one a small and regular acknowledgement of what had happened and what was owed. Marcus's interest in architecture turned into a school project in September. He called me on a Tuesday evening, called me, not his parents, which made something warm happen in my chest, and asked if he could come to the house and draw it. For the project. He wanted to document an old building that had history. "It's not that old," I said. "It's 40 years, he said, with the particular authority of an 11-year-old for whom 40 years is genuinely historical. He came on a Saturday with a sketchbook and 3 different pencils and the quiet focus I recognize now as a family trait. He walked around the outside of the house for an hour before he drew anything, looking at it from different angles, measuring things with his eye. Then he sat in the garden and drew for 2 more hours while I worked nearby and didn't bother him. When he showed me the finished sketch, I had to look at it for a moment before I could speak. He had drawn the house and the garden together. The house slightly behind, the garden in the foreground, the oak tree dominant and filling most of the left side of the page. The perspective made the tree look like it belonged to the house, or the house to the tree, the two things inseparable. Which was true, actually. After 30 years, it was true. In the bottom corner, in his careful 11-year-old handwriting, he had written, "Grandma's house," not the Hale estate, not the family property, not any of the loaded language that had surrounded this building for the past several months of my life. Grandma's house. I looked at it and I thought, yes, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it has always been. Underneath all the documents and the deeds and the shell companies and the ultimatums. A grandmother's house. A place where someone loved her family and built something real and tended it for 40 years and refused, when the moment came, to be moved from it. I told Marcus it was the best drawing I'd seen in a long time. He took the compliment seriously, the way serious people do, and asked if he could come back to draw the inside. "Whenever you want," I said. "The door is always open." In October, 8 months after the memorial dinner, I sat in the study on a quiet afternoon, and I took stock of what my life looked like. The business was being run properly, with Daniel at the lead and a board that was functioning the way boards are supposed to function, with oversight and accountability and the particular friction of people who actually ask questions. The first quarter under his leadership had been cautious. He had been right that he was cautious. But the numbers were honest, which they had not been for 31 months. And honest numbers are always a better foundation than impressive ones built on fiction. The repayment was ongoing. 3 installments in, no missed payments. Sandra had moved on to other cases, but she sent me a brief email once a month with a status note, which was more than her job required and which I appreciated. The house was mine, fully and legally and completely on record with no ambiguity remaining. William had filed everything necessary. The deed had never changed, but now there was no possibility of anyone claiming they hadn't known. It was documented. It was clear. It was done. The garden had finished its summer extravagance and was settling into fall. The roses going quiet, the leaves of the oak beginning to turn at the edges, the stone path looking particularly beautiful in the slanted October light. I had planted bulbs that morning, the Dutch kind that Richard used to order from a catalog, the catalog still coming to the house addressed to him, which I had found unbearable the first year and now found oddly comforting. Something continuing to expect him to be here. Something still believing he might want tulips in April. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, the grief-hollowed, going through the motions version who had said yes to a memorial dinner she hadn't fully wanted because she didn't have the energy to say no, who had sat at her own table and received an ultimatum and felt, beneath the cold clarity of her response, a genuine flicker of, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The fear of being seen accurately, of being exactly as diminished as they believed her to be. She had not been diminished. She had been quiet. And quiet, as I had learned, is not the same as empty. This is the thing I want you to understand. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever version of this story is happening in your life, because I know this story is not unique to me. There are 1,000 versions of this happening in 1,000 living rooms and kitchens and dining rooms at this very moment. Someone underestimating someone else. Someone mistaking silence for surrender. Someone assuming that because a person has not fought back yet, they do not know how. The people who underestimate you are counting on you to accept their estimate. They are counting on you to look at what they think of you and decide it must be accurate, because why would someone so confident be wrong? But confidence is not accuracy. Certainty is not truth. And the people who dismiss you most completely are often the ones who have spent the least time actually looking at you. The strength was always there. In the documents Richard filed in 2003, in the account I had kept in my own name since before the marriage, in 40 years of decisions made at kitchen tables that nobody put my name on, in the quiet, steady, absolutely unglamorous work of being the person who holds things together while everyone else is busy looking at the person in front of the room. The foundation does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply holds until someone tries to build something dishonest on top of it, until someone tries to pour a new structure over the old ground without checking what the ground actually is. And then the foundation does what foundations do. It tells the truth, solidly, without drama, without apology. The truth that this is what it is, and this is who built it, and nobody gets to simply decide otherwise. I was 64 years old. I was a widow. I had lost the person who knew me best in the world, and I had survived it, not gracefully, but really the way real survival looks, imperfect and exhausted, and sometimes ugly and ultimately standing. I had discovered that my eldest son was capable of a betrayal I would spend years fully processing. I had discovered that my daughter-in-law was capable of a cruelty that came, at its root, from a fear she hadn't known how to manage. I had discovered that I was not finished, not even close. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the garden. The October light, the angled, amber, almost apologetic light of a season preparing to end. It came through the study window and fell across Richard's desk and lit up the grain of the wood in a way that made it look like something alive. I sat in it and let it sit on me. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. The oak tree moved outside. The house settled around me. Its particular sounds, its particular language that I had been listening to for 41 years, and that I knew now I would continue to listen to for however many years remained. There's a version of this story where I tell you everything worked out beautifully, where Ethan became fully himself again, and Celeste became something better than she had been, and the family gathered at this table every Sunday with the ease of people who have never hurt each other. That version is not true, and I don't believe in stories that aren't true. The true version is messier and slower and more uncertain. Ethan was working on himself, genuinely working, and some weeks were better than others. Celeste remained who she was, with the modifications forced on her by consequence rather than by transformation, and I had accepted that this was probably the most I could expect. The family was finding its shape again, a different shape than before, one with some gaps in it that might fill in over time or might not. The true version is also this. I was okay. Actually okay, not performed okay, not the grief management version of okay that I had been performing for 2 years before the memorial dinner forced everything open. Genuinely, specifically, quietly, okay. I had my house, I had my garden, I had Daniel and Paula, and a 10-year-old who called me on Tuesday evenings to ask about architecture, and a 9-year-old who asked me why people were mean to each other and expected a real answer. I had the study with 2 desks in it, mine facing the window now, the afternoon light coming through right on schedule. I had the metal box with Richard's letter in it, and the letter he had written to me 8 years ago with the particular foresight of a man who paid attention, and the last lines of it that I didn't need to reread anymore because I had them by heart. The woman they forgot to fear. That's you, Maggie. That has always been you. I looked out at the garden, at the oak tree, tall in the October light, roots deep enough now that nothing short of catastrophe could move it. I thought, yes, that's exactly right. That has always been me. I just had to let them underestimate me long enough to remember it.